Everyone. Welcome to this program of Crisis and Hope, YU Voices, a joint project of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, Bernard Revel Graduate School, and Mada'eh HaYahadut, Judaic Studies at YU. Welcome everyone, and happy Hanukkah. I'm Joseph Angel, Associate Professor of Jewish History, and with me today is Stephen Fine, the Hurgen Professor of Jewish History and Director of the Center for Israel Studies at YU. Welcome, Steve.
I'm so happy to be with you today, Joe.
Just in time for the celebration of Hanukkah, we're here to talk about the Hasmoneans in history and in Jewish memory. So we're all familiar with this story of the Hasmoneans, this heroic family of priests who led the resistance against the religious persecutions of the Syrian Greeks. They succeeded in restoring Jewish religious freedoms and purified the temple. But what started as a resistance movement soon turned into a fight for national political independence. And the Hasmoneans would go on to establish an independent state in the biblical homeland, which lasted about 80 years. This is something which hadn't been seen by Jews for at the time for 400 years and wouldn't be seen again for another 2,000 years. So this 80-year period, it's a unique period in Jewish history from about 142 to 63 BCE. This dynasty lasted, and it was put to an end by the Romans who were encroaching upon the region at that time. Steve, you've been studying and writing about the Hasmoneans for quite a long time. What is it that you like most about them?
Joe, I really love the Hashmonaim because they're this complex mix of people that we look to as the pure against the defiled and the small versus the great, as we read in the prayer book. But we also have sources about them that make them very human and tell us about the great geopolitic that they're part of and the complexities of the Jewish community that they were trying to forge and that they were living within. And so we have a lot of information from a lot of sources, whether it be First Maccabees, which was their home document, or Second Maccabees, which was written by a Jew in Egypt, or Cyrenaica in North Africa, named Jason of Cyrenaica, or Josephus, or many others who provide insight into understanding them on top of all we know about the Hellenistic world and the reflection of the Talmud and the rabbis. And so we know a lot. And so for ancient history, this is a lot of sources. And that's what I love most.
Great. And I look forward to sharing some of these sources today with you.
Me too. So Joe,
yeah,
which source do you think is the place to start in talking about the Hashmonaim and their rise to power?
Well, for me, I'm busy much of the time researching Second Temple literature and Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Hasmoneans provide the real life backdrop of much of what I do and many of the texts that I'm interested in. But I would say if we're looking for the closest, I always look for the one that's closest in time to the events. I would look at 1 Maccabees. And Maccabees, you just mentioned, what is a text which was originally written in Hebrew by a supporter of the Hasmonean regime. Fascinatingly, it didn't get preserved by Jewish. I always, think of this as a very interesting fact that it didn't get preserved by Jewish tradition. It ends up, although it was written in Hebrew, and you get the sense that the original author would have liked it even to have been included in the Bible. It doesn't get passed down by Jewish tradition, and in fact, the church ends up preserving a Greek translation of it. But this is the text that really gets us very close to the happenings of the Hasmonean dynasty.
When I was studying First Maccabees in graduate school, it was my favorite. As a beginning Greek reader, I could open First Maccabees and really feel the Hebrew underneath it. It was not like a real Greek text like Second Maccabees. It feels like it comes from Eretz Israel at the end or beginning of the 1st century BCE.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of kais, the Greek word kai, meaning and, a reflective of, I think, what's probably the vav ha'ipuch, what we know as that vav ha'ipuch biblical form. Yeah, but unfortunately, not one Hebrew manuscript has come down to us, so we have it in Greek.
Cool. So which story do you love best?
One of the stories I love best kind of takes us into the story of what the Hasmonean dynasty is really dealing with. And so I just want to back up before I get into that and talk about one of my most, one of the ways that the Hasmoneans are most compelling to me. And that is something that I like to refer to as the old new problem, or the way that the Hasmoneans are dealing with the problem of tradition and innovation. So on the one hand, these are priests, they're Kohanim, they observe Jewish law, they value the Torah, they're fighting to restore the biblical ideals of the promised land and the temple in Jerusalem. On the other hand, they're a completely new phenomenon in Jewish history. They take the high priesthood, they seize political power, they even proclaim kings, not at first, but ultimately they're going to proclaim themselves kings. Of course, they're priests, they're not of the mandated Davidic line from which the kings are supposed to come. And they combine the two powers of priesthood and royalty. And even worse, they begin to act like Greek tyrants themselves. So you have this very interesting mixture of old and new represented by the Maccabees. And what we essentially have is this brand new state walking a tightrope between the ancient traditions of Judaism and the new Hellenistic environment around them. So you have in 1 Maccabees, actually, to understand what 1 Maccabees is doing, we really have to understand that, what's new about the Maccabean state. As I said earlier, in one way, they are reviving the biblical dream of a homeland, and the other, they are doing something completely new.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah.
No. So in doing this, they must have to legitimize themselves in light of what came before, so that they can create the new within the vessels of the old. So how do they do that?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're going to see in 1 Maccabees. The Hasmonean dynasty was not short of its detractors. We have many sources of contemporary Jews who had a real problem with them taking the Davidic mantle, right? And also claiming the high priesthood at the same time, thereby combining these two religious powers. And one way to fight back against that was to have your own PR, your own PR wing. And that's basically how I view 1 Maccabees is trying to legitimize the Hasmonean claims to power. It's a very friendly text to the Maccabees. And one way of doing that in the Second Temple period is you marshal the legitimacy of the Bible. You portray the Maccabees in terms of the old patriarchal traditions. And that's what we see in 1 Maccabees. Actually, Ronnie, if you could put on the first slide, I'll just show one example of how the book of 1 Maccabees does this. So you can see on the left side here, this is the famous story. Probably all of you know this story. This is when the father of the 5 Maccabean brothers, Mattathias, is viewing a public sacrifice that's being made by a Jew who's been coerced, or he's agreed to make a pagan sacrifice on an altar outside of Jerusalem. And he is filled with rage. He's filled with rage. He picks up a weapon and he goes and he slays his fellow Jew. And not only that, he also slays the king's officer who was with him. But it's very interesting to see how the book of 1 Maccabees portrays this. At the bottom, you see it says, "Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, son of Salu." So the book of Maccabees here is really what you're seeing is a very conscious attempt to portray the zealous violence of the founder of the Maccabean line as an emulation of the model provided by Pinchas in the Torah. And of course, what does Pinchas get in the Torah for his zeal? He is rewarded with Brit Kihunat Olam. He's rewarded with an everlasting priestly dynasty. And you get the sense here that the author of 1 Maccabees is trying to do the same thing. Just as the ancestor was zealous, so too the founder of this Maccabean dynasty deserves God's reward.
And so once you become zealous, that activates the possibility of eternal priesthood.
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
least in the minds of the Maccabees.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, the criticism, this is in response to things like there's a very old tradition in the Bavli in Kiddushin 66a, which is questioning the Hasmonean, the purity of the Hasmonean priestly lineage. So this would come as a rejoinder to that type of argumentation. Certainly also you had the Pharisees and the rabbis who were concerned about this phenomenon. You also had the Dead Sea Scrolls, which refer to the Hasmonean high priest as the wicked priest who was immoral and obsessed with, wealth, defiling the temple.
So we've come a long way from Mattathias and his sons and their holy fight to restore Jerusalem.
Yeah,
as their 80 years proceed.
Yeah, this is part of what I love about the study of literature and its Second Temple literature and its context. It gives you, you may have heard this story before, but hearing the background, the political background, and the battles being fought through the literature are really, really interesting and illuminating, and help us understand the Maccabees in a new light.
Cool.
What would be, from your perspective, an interesting source that would help us gain insight into the Maccabean dynasty?
One of the people that I really find interesting is John Hyrcanus I, otherwise known as Yochanan Kohen Gadol. And what you see on the right here is one of his coins. He ruled from 134 BCE. He's the son of Simon the Maccabee. He's the most successful of the Maccabees. He's living in a space between the decline of the Seleucids and anybody else coming in. So he has a really independent hand in dealing with his country. And the first thing he does is start spreading it. But before we go on, take a look at this coin, which uses the ancient biblical Paleo-Hebrew script to mention Yochanan Kohen Gadol and the Council of the Jews. We don't know exactly who they are, Chever HaYehudim. Some people have associated it with the Sanhedrin. Be that as it may, notice this coin with the wreath surrounding it. This is a typical coin of the sort that cities all over the East were minting. If you went up to Sidon, you'd see the very same script. And so on the one hand, these Hasmoneans are just like everybody else in the world. What else could they be? But at this moment, under Yochanan Hyrcanus, under John Hyrcanus, we find the Maccabees in a mode of expansion. And so the first place they go is north towards Samaria. Then they continue to the Galilee and across the Jordan into it, and then down south to Idumea, and then west toward Gaza. John Hyrcanus is really trying to recreate this Jewish holy land. And coins like this, which have no images on them, are the way that he spreads the message that within this territory, life is different. But one of the places I find most interesting, and Ronnie, can we have the next slide, please? Is, just flip down, is Mount Gerizim. Now, many people will know that I spend a lot of time with Mount Gerizim as part of the YU Israelite Samaritans project. This is the site of the Samaritan temple, above Shechem. Now, Mount Gerizim is called in Samaritan tradition the Blessed Mountain, the Holy Mountain, the place where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, the place where the tabernacle stood. This is their holy mountain. Every year they go up there on pilgrimage a few times. The sacrifice of the Passover sacrifice takes place a little bit lower down on the mountain. But what we're looking at is the ruins of the temple as it was destroyed by John Hyrcanus around 116 BCE. Now, in the center, that's a church that was built in the 5th century. You have to sort of ignore that. But look down the sides of the hills and over to the right and to the left, you'll see the remains of a massive temple, the earliest parts of which go to the 5th century BCE. The most recent parts of it go to the time of, say, Ben Sira, 2nd, 3rd century BCE. This is a massive undertaking for a huge pilgrimage site, which John Hyrcanus could not have tolerated with his belief, of course, in one temple to the one God, as Josephus describes it, in the place that God shall choose, not the place that the Samaritans said was the place that God has chosen. And so in his pursuit of a Jewish national state, it was imperative for him to take apart the Samaritan temple and hence Samaritan local identity, which he wasn't successful at. But it was so important that in the book that also tells us about Hanukkah, the earliest book in the rabbinic canon called Megillat Ta'anit, the scroll fast, the scroll of fast, which by the way was edited by Vered Noam, who is the first woman to win the Israel Prize. We read as follows: Be-21 Be Yom Har Gerizim. On the 21st of Kislev is the day of Mount Gerizim. Now, what does this celebrate? This celebrates the day that John Hyrcanus went up on Mount Gerizim and destroyed and created the ruins that you see before you. You can imagine that this was not a happy day for the Samaritans, but for the Hasmoneans and their desire to push forward and create this Deuteronomic nation state in all of Eretz Israel, this was a pivotal moment and hence a holiday. I can clearly say that no one has celebrated Yom Gerizim for a very, very long time. But you know, there's another explanation for the purpose of this holiday that was created long after the events themselves. Joe, can you tell us about that?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. Yeah, there is a addendum to, so as you mentioned, the Megillat Ta'anit is this very old late Second Temple period text. It's a list of about 3 dozen days on which it was forbidden for Jews to fast or show signs of mourning. And it's simply a list, and many of these lists of dates commemorate Maccabean victories, such as the one we're talking about now. Then, in addition to that, we have what's called the Scholion, which is got these Hebrew comments upon these dates, which talk about the events and try to explain further what happened on those days. So we have this kind of apocryphal story in the Scholion to this date, which describes how Shimon HaTzadik was approached by hold on, sorry. there was
Alexander.
Yeah, sorry. There was a dispute between the Samaritans and the Jews. The Samaritans wanted to plow Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and destroy the temple. And Alexander the Great, this is a story also, there's a version of it in the Babylonian Talmud, is approached outside of the city of Jerusalem by Shimon HaTzadik, who Alexander, at the moment he sees him, he dismounts and he bows down. He says, "This is the face of the man who I saw in my dream last night." And ultimately he gives, he reverses the decree, v'nahafochu, and he allows the Jews to exact vengeance on the Samaritans, and they proceed to plow the city and plant it with plant undesirable plants all over the place. Most scholars take this story as kind of a legendary version, but look at the kernel as probably remembering this event of which you talk about, Steve, the destruction of the temple by John Hyrcanus. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about, Steve, was Samaria geographically, it's an important area. It separates the Galilee from Judea. So is John Hyrcanus doing this simply because he doesn't like that the Samaritans have a temple on Har Gerizim?
No, I don't think so at all. I think this is about the unification of the Jewish polity, north, south, east, and west, and expansion of those territories. And then there's these Torah-keeping descendants of the 10 tribes whom Jews were ambivalent about at this moment, but not in Tannaitic times. In other words, it went back and forth. The Samaritans, who called themselves the Shomrim, not the people of Samaria, but the keepers of the Torah. And, having two nations of Israel is one complex thing. Now, the good news, everybody, is that Dr. Angel has written about this subject in our forthcoming book, which is The Samaritans, a Biblical People. And Shana Schick and I have written about the rabbinic part later on, and how this develops over time. And it's complex and it's rich, and it shows the depths of relationship that the Second Temple period spawned. Some people even think that the ultimate break between Jews and Samaritans took place because of this destruction. You can imagine that, after all, take their destruction and see it through our own eyes with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, which, by the way, their descendants cheered for a considerable amount of time. So this was complex. It's only in modern times that this feud has been resolved. So to have living people who go back to the time of the Maccabees, other than us, I think that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Steve, we're
we
focused.
have.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say we're focusing a lot on the Samaritans. I just want the audience to know that John Hyrcanus did more than just attack Samaria. He also engaged in conquests in the Galilee and in the south, an area which is now the Negev, a people known as the Idumeans, and he even engaged in a forced conversion of the peoples there. So this is part of a much larger, I just want people to understand, it's part of a much larger program of the Hasmoneans. Ultimately, John Hyrcanus' son, Alexander Yonai, will take it to the nth degree and really expand the state even further, expanding into the Transjordan and the coastal plain on the west, which was of supreme importance for access to the coasts. And so this was really part of a scheme, a Hasmonean scheme, which comes to fruition. The Maccabees, if you think of the Maccabean brothers fighting, as I said at the outset, they're fighting for independence. At the end of this, you see it's much more than that. It is about the biblical patrimony, the biblical homeland, and they're even they appear to be justifying their conquests with this ideology of looking back towards the biblical conquests of the land.
So John Hyrcanus is the new Joshua in a real sense.
Just like Matityahu was the new Pinchas, right? So we're seeing a little pattern here.
Absolutely. Now, we have one more slide. And you can imagine that we couldn't do a program about the Hashmonaim without stopping at the menorah. So, Joe, what do we see here?
I mean, it's hard to see, but I definitely see on the right something that you have written about extensively. I see a beautiful looking menorah. And on the left, I see like a shulchan. I see 4 legs and a lateral line. But this coin that you're showing dates back to the time of the last Hasmonean hope. His name was Mattathias Antigonus, who reigned from about 40 BCE to 37 BCE, right at the moment when the Hasmonean dynasty had already really collapsed, but was the area was stuck between these two great powers, the Romans on the west and the Parthians on the east. And the Parthians in 40 BCE ransacked through the land of Israel and through Jerusalem, and they empowered actually this last of the Hasmoneans to have control of the state. And the Roman Herod had to flee. He would be back shortly in 37, and ultimately this man, Matthias, would be captured and executed. But Steve, I'm very curious here to kind of hear your thoughts on the imagery that was chosen by this last of the Hasmoneans.
You know, Joe, it's such a sad story because poor Mattathias, when he spoke Hebrew, Mattatyahu, and Antigonus, when he spoke Greek, was taken as a young person off to Rome as a hostage after Pompey took the Holy Land in 63 BCE and began the process of Romanization. And he keeps going back and forth. Eventually, as you said, he ends up siding or gaining support from the other international power, the Persians. And so little tiny Judea stuck between the Persians and the Romans coming in. And Mattathias Antigonus, who knew the Romans well, and on the other hand, was supported by the Persians, is in that last-ditch effort. Now, if you think about Hasmonean coins, they look like the one we saw before, with wreaths and letters and that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, in the last moment, before Herod the Great takes over and Rome's control is total, they put out this bit of propaganda. And you see, it's an ugly little coin. It's about the size of a penny, a little bit smaller. There are very few of them that have the whole picture of the menorah or the whole picture of the table of the shewbread, the Shulchan Lechem Apanim, because they took this cruddy metal and stamped on it this symbol, which, you know, later on the first revolt and second revolt coins, we'd see Lecherut Yerushalayim, for the freedom of Jerusalem. And I can imagine if they thought of it, that would have been a pretty good logo for these guys too. And so just as Romans, who he knew well, would put symbols from their religion, from their religious service on their coins, for the first time Jews did it too. On the Hebrew side, he put the table for the showbread with those little round things on top are the stacked up breads. The reason it's so awful is because the table was never a very good symbol, because a table is a table is a table. There's nothing unique about it. But what he put on the other side, on the side where he put his name in Greek, he put the lampstand of the temple. Now, the Hasmoneans were known for rebuilding the temple, for constantly making the temple more beautiful. The Talmud in Menachot describes how they began by taking the lampstand and making it out of tin. First, they started putting spears. Then they made a unique one out of tin when they came in and took over. Then they made it out of brass. Then they made it out of silver. And only then did they make it out of gold, which really fits, Joe, what we know about the constant process of upgrading the temple all the way through the Hasmonean period. But what do we see here? A family that we now know, even from the half hour we've been speaking, was really, really complex. Really, really complex. But when push comes to shove, they call on the national symbols. They call on the people to unify, because no matter what, Mattathias, also known as Antigonus, is a whole lot better than Herod and the Roman Empire. And
that's right.
This is sort of the Alamo coin, right? This is the end.
Right, and that's what we see in Herod's reign, is that the people are so fed up with his tyranny that anybody who has the bloodline of the Hasmoneans, or a hint of blood, a drop of blood from the Hasmonean family, is looked at as a possible salvation. At least it's not the Herodians. And Herod himself murdering every male descendant, and even some his own wife, because of his paranoia and his jealousy toward the Hasmoneans. One thing Herod did succeed at, though, was building over the remains of Hasmonean fortresses and really rebuilding the whole country in the image of Rome. And that is really how the story you said it was sad. There's something sad about that to me, right? That there's kind of an erasure of the Hasmonean dynasty.
Yes, and the temple that he built was the source of both pride and ambivalence. The rabbis could say, he who's never seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building, right? On the other hand, they know who this guy is. It's one big complexity. And who tells us the story of this? A priest named Yosef, son of Mittitiyahu, the same Mittitiyahu, the same Mattathias that is the Hebrew name of Mattathias Antigonus, the priest, who is, of course, a descendant of the Hasmonean family, who spent the rest of his life both protecting Judaism and pushing Jewish acculturation into the Roman Empire at that most awful moment of the Jewish War of 66 to 74. But that's another story. What we have in the Hasmoneans is the festival that was sort of improbable, the festival that of rededicating the temple, the festival that took place at the winter solstice. I don't know if you noticed, Joe, but last week Shabbos was 2 minutes longer than it's going to be next week. Right in the middle of Hanukkah, we transfer from the world getting darker to the world getting lighter. And the Talmud talks about that Adam saw this, and that was the root of lighting candles on Hanukkah. The Hasmoneans have a lot of darkness, but ultimately their rhetoric and their story, you and I live with and light our candles with our kids every single year. And I don't know about you, but I carry the Hasmoneans with me almost every day.
Absolutely. And I don't want to ruin those beautiful words with any more darkness here. So Chag Sameach, Steve.
Chag Sameach, Chag Urim Sameach. By the way, everyone knows it's called the Festival of Lights because Mr. Josephus named it the Festival of Lights. And from Josephus, it came into the Hebrew language. So as we all add our lives, remember Josephus, who tells us so much about the Hasmoneans. And now we're open for conversation. So folks, please, Ronnie. We're on.
Hi, everybody. If you have a question, you could either send it into the chat. Okay. I've told my students who are here, happy to see so many of you here, to send this question into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I'll be looking at the chat.
We just had a question. Somebody asked a question whether Chag Urim, the Festival of Lights, is the festival of fires, right? Which is a little semantic, except of course that Josephus says lamps, and so it's very clear what kind of lights he's talking about. When
he uses the Greek
Hebrew,
word.
it became Luchtoi, right? And when he went in, right? And when he went, and so when it went into modern Hebrew, it became Urim in the earliest translations, which is, of course, the source, interestingly, of the torch runs to Modi'in of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so the Festival of Lights became the Festival of the Torches. And so every single word, as we see, and that question is great, matters. And the cultural translation of our holiday is what a Jewish holiday is supposed to be, wonderfully multivalent, has all sorts of stuff in it. Is anybody else?
I want to just say, I want to welcome a few people who are here. Rabbi Blau, wonderful to see you here. Thank you so much. I see Dean Noam Wasserman has come to the class. And that's wonderful to join the conversation here. And Sylvia Hershkovitz is here, the founding director of the museum, if I'm not mistaken. Really, and it's really great to see so many people. I'm sure I'm missing some people, some faculty members, but and wonderful to see so many students. And let's see, there's a lot more on this. Some more questions here. Does the scolion This is from Professor Jess Olson, who had to go to another meeting. Does the Scholion to Megillat Ta'anit explain this further?
Yeah, we talked about that already.
Yeah.
The story of Alexander and
Yeah, exactly. Someone else also asked the question about Alexander, which is right. And yes. Oh, hi, Mr. Levine. Would you like to have a question?
Yeah, the iconography on the first coin, the Yochanan Cohen Gadol coin, is the wreath, is that political? Does that mean a crown? The same way that on Hasmonean coins, on one side it would say king in Greek because they didn't want to mess with politics, and in Hebrew the way Cohen Gadol. Is it meant to be political?
I can share the image if you want. Is it worth sharing?
Well, first of all, let me say that Nachman Levine is a fellow of the Center for Israel Studies and quite a scholar of Midrash, and I'm honored that you're here, Nachman.
Thank you.
Look, anything on a coin is political. You don't send this out. It says that Mordechai was known by his monitin, which doesn't mean his reputation. It means his money, right? From the word monitas. So they send out your money. Your money is how you project your power in the world. And so what are they saying by putting the wreath, which anybody in that world who spoke any language would know is a symbol for victory, right? We know exactly what they're saying. The same way that they would use the script, which on the one hand, Phoenicians would use as well and could read it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're making this local propaganda statement without images, the same way they would use a cornucopia on the other side of the coin, right? With a pomegranate, which is their standard image. We find it in Jerusalem in stone carvings as well. And so all of this together makes the announcement that their monitin, both visually, textually, and politically, goes out through their coins. And with John Hyrcanus, as opposed to some of the others, there's the "don't mess with me." That's always part of his message. That's great.
Yeah, I want to add to that comment. There's a great question, Nachman. The laurel wreaths are one of the most common symbols on Hasmonean coins. I think almost every single one has the laurel wreath surrounding the name of the ruler. And we know by comparison with the Seleucid coins, Seleucid kings who were contemporaries of the Hasmoneans also used laurel wreaths, but in their case, they were always accompanied by some sort of pagan iconography, Greek mythology, or the image of the king himself. And what you have here, Steve, is exactly right. You have this adaptation. The Hasmoneans are announcing their power in a very Greek way, at the same time as it's a very Jewish way. So you have replacing the image of the king in the center on the front of the coin. That's another point you should know, is that Greeks put it usually on the back of their coin. The Hasmoneans are putting this front and center on the front of the coin, the Hebrew inscription, and it's a focus on the high, usually it says high priest, Kohen Gadol. It's not talking about the king, and this may have been a way of pointing out the uniqueness. Steve mentioned the Paleo Hebrew script, which is hearkening back to the time of King David, which is all about legitimacy, Jewish legitimacy. So it's for me, it's fascinating, the hybridity to see at the same time a Greek coin. You're also looking at a uniquely Jewish coin.
Now, remember, the wreath is probably the most common image in ancient synagogue architecture, and probably more than menorahs in Israel. There are wreaths everywhere, which sets a context for, say, a piyut that appears in the Shabbat morning prayers that says, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, ki eved ne'aman karata lo, kliut tiferet b'roshon netata, v'amdo lefanecha al har Sinai. Moses was called a faithful servant because he did your task, right? A crown of glory, or really a wreath of glory, was placed on his head as he stood before you before Mount Sinai, right? Giving Moshe a wreath is like making him the victor in the Olympics, or being a king, right? This is a metaphor that Jews well understood, and we see they understood it as far back as the Maccabees and adopted it and developed it and thought about it. And this is one of those wonderful ways that things from the big world stay with Jews and are transformed in ways that become meaningful like forever. And so we talk about the wreath of Moses every single Shabbat morning.
There's a question from one of my students, Elon Boshin. What do you reckon the reason to be for the Anshe Knesset Gedolas not including Maccabees in the Tanakh? Does it have to do with the Hashmonaems arrogating themselves to power inappropriately? And I'd add another question. Do we find them ever referring to it at all? To the stories that are in there, even in secondhand ways? Does Chazal in any way deal with the literature that's the package that is Maccabees in any way? But first of all, what is the reason? Do we know the reason why they wouldn't put it in there?
This is a supercharged question with a long, long history. Steve, do you want to go first?
Oh, thank you, Joe.
Those are the best.
Look, Maccabees is a late book. In the Jewish canon, nothing that comes from later than the Persian period and is written in Hebrew or a little bit of Aramaic is accepted in the Hebrew canon. Now, Greek-speaking Jews did take Maccabees, and that became part of their Tanakh. And so, if someone out there is Catholic or Greek Orthodox or any of the various Eastern churches, and they open their Bible, they'll say, "What do you mean? It's right here in my Bible, right?" What for Jews and then for Protestants after Jews, it's in a secondary position. Now, do rabbis refer to First Maccabees? Not directly, but Josephus does. He actually used First Maccabees as a source. And so a lot of the transmission goes through there. Starting in the Renaissance, Jews were reading the book of Josephus. Some of Josephus found its way into a book called Josipon in the 9th century, which is a Latin shortened version of Josephus and then it's made sort of Jewish medieval in the 9th century. And so First Maccabees stories find their way through Josephus into Josipon and into the world of Torah. The book of Josipon is quoted by Tosafot. It was so important that one particular little boy of some fame who had his own copy, because I've seen it, and talked about it, named David Green, who came from a Zionist family, when he was in yeshiva, was inspired by the battles described of the Maccabees in Josipon. And when he came to the land of Israel, changed his name from David Green to David Ben Gurion. And so there's lots of ways that First Maccabees found their ways into the system, but not through any direct past. So that's how I would answer it.
That's a great model for thinking about how a lot of knowledge passes through the generations. It's not a direct line, especially when before publishing, right, books have mysterious histories, right? That's
wonderfully mysterious histories.
They started reading Josephus in the Renaissance because it was translated to Hebrew, or because they learned Latin?
No, it's even more interesting. Josephus first appears in Hebrew, I've been writing about this, in 1556 in a addition to a book called Sefer Yuchasin by Abraham Zechuto, who was an exile from Portugal, by a guy named Sulam. Now, this piece was translated apparently from a Latin translation that was translated into Spanish and then spread around the world. And so Spanish-speaking Jews were reading the Spanish translations of Josephus. And at that amazing moment, we tend to think about that moment after 1492 or 1496 as awful, right? But the reality is, in all of those places where they found refuge, the printing press allowed them to create this virtual community where all of our books found their way into print, from the most obscure to the most central, from the Babylonian Talmud to Sefer Yuchasin to Josipon to pieces of Josephus. And so starting at that moment, there are people who tell you that Jews in the medieval period or the early modern period didn't care anything about history, but they're wrong. They cared a lot about history, to the point of setting up printing presses wherever they went in order to make sure it was readable and accessible. And that's how Josephus entered back in, because people could now read Josipon wherever they were. And then they had other translations, first of Josephus's work against Apion into Hebrew. But then much more as time went on, Jews were reading Yosef HaKohen, as they called him. And he had quite an authority. It's really neat.
There's a question from Judy. Doesn't Josephus, this goes back to the Urim question, and I think it's an interesting question. Doesn't Josephus say he isn't sure why the festival is called Urim? How is this understood?
Joe, do you want to do it?
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe, Joe, sorry, could you maybe explain the question behind the questions? I think there's a subtext to the question that maybe be good to kind of, in other words.
Well, I'm going to address the question first.
Fine. Maybe I'll ask a separate question. Sorry.
Josephus, actually, in that passage to which you refer, you're absolutely right. He says, he kind of gives a midrashic answer. He says it's called the days of light because darkness, he kind of has this metaphoric understanding that the liberty was so great that it turned all our darkness to light. And he does not mention Nes Hanukkah. And that, of course, is another big issue in scholarship, is that it's only the Bavli, My Hanukkah, which Ronnie, that's what you're referring to, I assume, right? Which mentions the actual miracle of the 8 days.
Well, this is Judy. This is actually Chuck, Judy's husband, who asked the question. That's really what I wanted to explore, that if we get so much from Josephus, here he ends up with a homily to justify the interpretation of the name, which clearly, well, does not focus upon the political or the religious or the military, certainly not the Pach Hashemin, which only comes from the Scholion, on to Megillah Tanit. So that was a deeper question. You really got me right. This is Chuck Shear, a Bernard Revel alumnus.
So Chuck, let's play this for a minute, okay? Because the fact that Josephus isn't quite sure what he's up to, right? And falls back on the Afela Yom Tov model, right? From darkness to light. Having told you the whole story, you have to read the whole book. He tells you all these awful things about Hasmoneans and wonderful things about Hasmoneans. And at the end of it, he says, by the way, we have this holiday, and that's why, right? It's an unusual case that the Chachamim ask the question, "My Hanukkah," right? They don't say "My Rosh Hashanah," and then they gave 4 or 5 different answers. Some of them embedded in the Gemara, some of them in more obscure midrashim. The Kumaseh, of course, is the Nes Pach Hashemin. But Chazal were not completely satisfied with any one answer, clearly. Now, the nice part is, as I tell my students every semester, all of those sources are collected by Yechiel Halevi Epstein in the Aruch HaShulchan, his wonderful halachic compendium of the turn of the century, where he gives all of the possibilities of first Maccabees and second Maccabees and the various midrashim, and ends that Nes Pach Hashemin is the statement by Kadosh Baruch Hu, by God, that this holiday is a real holiday, that it's accepted. And so there's been lots of thought about all of these questions for a very long time. And the answer as a historian is teku, which of course in traditional terminology means tishbi yavo yitaretz kushiot, right? That Eliyahu will come and figure this out for us. And that's where we are with it. That's the end of the conversation. Yeah, the Aruch HaShulchan is really cool. It's been translated. So anybody wants to find it, that piece of the Aruch HaShulchan is in one piece of the modern Orthodox literature, and somebody will know exactly where. I give my students the original almost every semester.
We have another question from Eli Natan. That's how it's his screen name. And that is, the question is, how did the Maccabees see themselves in contradistinction to the Seleucid Greeks? Which commonalities did they grapple with, and which distinctions did they emphasize?
Great question. A great question. I think we saw on the Yehochanan coin kind of the, an answer to this, that on the one hand, they were very much part of this Greco-Roman world, Greek world at this time. Well, it's still Roman. The Romans are, yes, already there. That they are depending on their coinage on Seleucid symbols, right? They put helmets, they put cornucopiae, they put anchors. They are interested in unifying their territory, and they view themselves also, they are very accomplished diplomats. They realize that they have to talk to these people, and they accomplish as much as they can in the realm of diplomacy. They're using Greek language on their coins, right? Although Hebrew is more common. And so they're, on the one hand, they're drawing their models of power from the Greeks, the symbols of power. At the same time, you have, what we saw in that coin, the Hebrew, right? The Paleo-Hebrew, the references back to the Bible, back to what makes us special. And I have a quote actually somewhere on my desk. It's one of my favorite quotes from 1 Maccabees, and I had it in my notes, which I think gives you a great conversation between Simon Maccabee, who reigned from 142 to 135. He never called himself king, but he was both political ruler and high priest. And he's having a conversation with Antiochus VII, and they're arguing about territory. And Antiochus VII sees Simon and the Hasmoneans as this upstart who's stealing his territory. He has no right to it. He says as follows. This is Antiochus VII, 1 Maccabees 15. Now then, hand over the cities that you have seized and the tribute money of the places that you have conquered outside the borders of Judea. Otherwise, we will come and make war on you. Only Judea belongs to the Jews. You don't belong outside of that. And what is Simon's reply? Listen to this. Simon said to him, we have neither taken foreign land nor seized foreign property, but only the inheritance of our ancestors, which at one time had been unjustly taken by our enemies. So it's very strong, right? And this will ultimately be the ideology, the turning back to the patriarchal, the heritage of the Bible and the conquest itself, which differentiates them, right? It's a Jewish Hellenistic state, not just a Hellenistic state.
Fascinating. I'm seeing someone else have a question. Maybe they want to just ask it.
Yeah, can I ask?
Please.
Could you please repeat the title of your new book?
I think that maybe the new
the
book,
Samaritan book.
The new book that you announced, and you said the title very quickly and I couldn't write it down.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Your new book.
Oh, wow. We have a huge project at YU.
Yeah, maybe explain. That'd be
The
great.
YU Israelite Samaritans Project. It includes an exhibition that's going to open at the Museum of the Bible in 2022. It includes a cookbook. It includes a major documentary film made with the new fund for film and for cinema and television in Israel by my friend and collaborator Moshe Alafi. It includes the exhibition book, which is going to come out this fall with YU Press and EJ Brill, called The Samaritans, a Biblical People. Since I didn't write all of it, I can tell you it's a wonderful book. It really is going to, the people who wrote it, they're amazing essays. There are 25 of them, more or less, on every aspect of this fascinating relationship between the two Israels, which was always a shock, the two Israels, right? The 850 of them who venerate Mount Gerizim, and the rest of us. And so keep your eyes open. Our cookbook is now available on Amazon. The Samaritan Cookbook.
Samaritan Cookbook.
Could you please tell me where the museum is that you mentioned?
It won't exist until 2022, so we'll keep it up. You will hear everything.
You mentioned the name of the museum. What was the name and where is it?
Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C.
And it's called the Jewish Museum?
No, let me not deal with that now, okay?
Oh, okay.
But yes, thank you. But please send me an email. all of this is a project of the Center for Israel Studies, which is very, very exciting. And you can learn much more about it on our website.
Hi, Stephen.
Okay, anything else?
This is Professor Sylvan Capel. Hi. I wanted to ask
Sylvan.
you, in theological terms, how syncretistic were the Hasmoneans or the contemporary or other contemporary Jews? That's to say, were they condemning the Greek religion as pagan and completely unacceptable, or were they, for example, identifying the chief of the Greek pantheon with their God as the universal God? What kind of position did they take on the theological relationships between those views?
Joe, do you want to do that one?
Sure.
I did the last one.
I mean, these were observant Jews who archaeology tells us cared about ritual purity. We found ritual baths at their palaces. The question, though, becomes which area of, which type of Jewish law they're following. They're definitely staying away from graven images. But there is a story that's preserved in both Josephus and in the Gemara of something that happens at the end of the life either in Josephus, it happens at the time of John Hyrcanus, and in Chazal, it happens in the time of Alexander Yanai, that you have a switching from following the rules of the Pharisees, the oral traditions of the Pharisees, to those of the Sadducees. And this is actually, we did something we didn't talk about at all, Steve, but it's a big can of worms that I love to talk about because I study the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's all about sectarianism. And so what you have here is bad memories in rabbinic literature about that time when the Hasmoneans went from being under our influence to not being under our influence and following Sadducean ways. We even hear of reforms they were making at the temple. They all served as high priests, but they weren't following the exact same halacha. I think to kind of tweak your question a little, it's not so much Hasmoneans versus Greeks, it's Hasmoneans amongst Jews, right? So they're definitely religious Jews, it's just a question of how.
Let me add another piece. That's great. It's very difficult to think about this as a one-for-one Judaism versus Hellenism, which is what's been done for most of history, because then it's the Jews versus the Greeks or the Europeans versus Judaism. It's all about the Emancipation Project. What we're really dealing with is not how Greek are you and how Jewish are you, but we're dealing with a 3D chessboard where you're a little bit of this and you're a little bit of this and you're up and down and sideways, right? In other words, this is a complex mix. My friend Yaakov Elman alav shalom used to refer to this period as one big chunk pot with all these different things in this one pot and then cooking. And so, the potatoes will absorb a little bit more meat in different ways than the carrots, and the carrots will begin to disappear. And my wife's vegetarian, so I don't really know about this, but you get my point. All of these admixtures of relationship and what people emphasize because they live in the world in which they live. After all, we're emphasizing the marvelous complexities of this world because we are the world of Torah Mada. We're the world where putting the different parts of our identities together is an essential part of our lives. And so doing Jewish history gives us a palette, and it gives us a piece of canvas, and it gives us a place to paint and think about our own complexities. Other people find that completely meaningless or deny it or emphasize the American side far more than the Jewish side. In other words, this is all about balancing identity in our world by Yamim Ahem, Bazman Hazeh, right? And so is it Hellenism versus Judaism? Is it syncretism, which is a word we don't really use so much anymore, right? Is it syncretism versus purity? Well, the way we frame it in Al Nisim, it certainly is, right? But as soon as we scratch it just a little bit further, we find out that those pure people were often deeply pure, right? They can also be something else done another moment. The Ramban himself talked about people who are menuvalim b'shuta Torah. We have every possibility of behavior within our community. And by studying the Maccabees, we can look in the mirror sometimes, which for me is one of the exciting things about them as well. And any more questions, or should we move on? Okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this really exciting discussion. I want to thank my friend Joe Angel for this exceptionally meaningful for me moment. Crisis and Hope, YU Voices, is a project of the YU Center for Israel Studies, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, the Bernard Revel Graduate School, and Mada'ei HaYahadut, Judaic Studies at Yeshiva University. Please, everyone, stay safe. Hanukkah Sameach, happy holidays, and most of all, Shalom from Yeshiva University.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.